This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning. This is the Council's third work session in which we will review the County Executive's proposed general plan, HOCO by Design. The proceeding this morning is a hybrid meeting which is being held in person and via WebEx teleconference. It's also available to the public via video stream online at the County Council website. The Council will conduct a series of work sessions and public hearings to review and obtain additional public comment on the proposed HOCO by Design. Today's session covers Chapter 9, Supporting Infrastructure, Chapter 10, Managing Growth, and Chapter 8, Public School Facilities. The Council will host public hearings in June, July, and September. A complete calendar of Council meetings regarding the general plan can be found on the Council's website. At this time, I'm going to do a roll call of the Council members. Mr. Youngman?
Here.
Vice Chair Young?
Here.
Dr. Jones?
Morning, everyone.
Good morning. And Ms. Walsh should be joining us shortly. In terms of our agenda this morning, we'll hear a 20-minute presentation on supporting infrastructure before starting a 60-minute Q&A period at 9:56 a.m. Then we'll move on to managing growth and public school facilities at 10:50 a.m. We'll take a 30-minute lunch break at 11:30 a.m. following the 40-minute presentation before returning for 90 minutes of Q&A. Our order for Q&A is D1, D2, D3, D4, D5. We'll now proceed with our agenda. Ms. Kendall?
Good morning, members of the County Council. It's a pleasure to join you here again today to continue our work sessions about HOCO by Design. I'm joined by the following HOCO by Design team members: our Planning Supervisor, Kate Bollinger, Deputy Director, Jessica Bella, and Matt Newcester. He is available online from City Explained. He is our consultant who's been working with us throughout this 3+ year process. In advance of the work session, everyone hopefully received fairly detailed slides about the topics that are before you today, about the chapters. As we go through our presentation, I do just want to point out that we are not going to speak to all of the points on the slides. We are going to keep our talking points fairly high level so we can ensure that you have sufficient time for Q&A. But as these chapters and topics, as you already heard, are of great importance to the county, and also this is the first time we've ever included a public schools facilities chapter, we did provide you with a few more details than what we would normally provide in a presentation. And thank you, Councilmember Rigby, for letting us know what the order of presentation will be today. But I also do want to take a moment to just express my gratitude and thanks to all of the other agencies, department heads, office administrators, and staff who are joining us today from the following agencies. Thank you, Department of Public Works, Department of Recreation and Park, Department of Fire and Rescue Services, the Howard County Police Department, and our Office of Budget. And then when we get into the Public Schools Facilities and Managing Growth chapters, we're also joined by the Office of Transportation, the Department of Public Works, and our Office of School Planning from Howard County Public School System. And of course, I also want to thank a couple of our other members from the Department of Planning and Zoning who are here today, Jeff Bronow, and then also Susan Overstreet. So with that, now I'd like to turn it over to Kate Bollinger, who will go through the presentation about supporting infrastructure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mary, and good morning, members of the County Council. So, the Supporting Infrastructure chapter speaks to various categories of infrastructure, and we recognize that the maintenance and enhancement of these categories is critical to meeting existing and future community needs. So categories that are covered in the chapter include police protection, fire and rescue, recreation and parks, county and allied agency facilities, drinking water supply and wastewater treatment, and solid waste management. The chapter also includes policies that are related to making infrastructure more sustainable and equitable, including incorporating equity into capital planning. And as has been noted, this is going to be a brief presentation, so I'm going to be walking through groupings of these infrastructure categories and highlighting some, but not all, of the policies and actions. But before getting into those policies, we're going to start with what we heard from the community. So throughout our process, we heard repeated praise for the county's amenities, for its high-quality recreational offerings, for its library system, and for its high-performing public schools. We also heard how residents want to see continued investment in these services. Wi-Fi came up in terms of calling for access in public spaces and buildings. And when it came to public spaces, we heard suggestion that there should be flexibility in how the community can use both indoor and outdoor spaces. There were different opinions when it came to shared septic systems in the rural West. We heard concerns, but we also heard others expressing support with interest in how small-scale development could be supported by the exploration of new infrastructure models. And finally, we heard about the importance of maintaining and investing in wastewater treatment. So moving to the topics, the first grouping covers sustainable and equitable infrastructure and equity in capital planning. So just to bring you back to Chapter 1 and the introduction, where we had a definition of sustainability. And in HOCO by Design, sustainability is more than environmental sustainability. It also speaks to shaping growth and preservation in a manner that responsibly balances and grows fiscal resources to deliver government services that enhance quality of life. And then returning to Chapter 9, to the supporting infrastructure chapter, we speak to how the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee recommendations emphasized an increasing need to maintain and rebuild existing infrastructure and also to prioritize infrastructure needs. So as Mary noted, our consultant, Matt Noonkester, is here, and he's available if there are questions with respect to how maintenance is becoming an increasingly important need in communities he's working in throughout the country. Another issue or practice that's emerging across the country is equity in capital planning. And in our region, in 2021, the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, the BMC, published a report that offers best practices for CIP development, including addressing equity. And among the report's guidance, there were suggestions to engage underserved communities in decision-making processes, and also to develop an equity-based approach to capital planning. So for policies and actions, highlighting here, HOCO by Design calls for prioritizing CIP requests that implement the general plan, making existing and deferred maintenance projects a priority, and prioritizing equity in capital improvement planning and programming. The chapter also calls for exploring and implementing diverse and inclusive outreach processes as an opportunity to build on the county's existing participatory process. And finally, HOCO by Design calls for incorporating equity measures into prioritization of capital projects. All right, so moving on to the next grouping of topics that deal with public safety, police protection, and fire and rescue. So the police department is separated into two patrol districts, which you see on the map. The Southern District in the lighter orange covers most of Columbia and the southeastern part of the county, and the Northern District covers the rest of the county. Call volume generally increases with population growth, and hiring new officers and procuring new patrol vehicles and equipment is generally a priority. And however, there's also a need for a physical presence that's been recognized in downtown Columbia, so the county should explore a third district. And policies and actions related to police protection highlighted here include evaluating the need for new or modified police facilities and ensuring adequate staffing and equipment for the department. So turning next to fire and rescue, there are 14 stations in the county and a 15th is under design. Call volume increases with employment growth, with residential growth, and also in response to changing demographics. And increasing call volume may result in the need for additional stations. So policies and actions highlighted here include constructing and staffing new and replacement stations, renovating existing stations as appropriate, and continuing to construct underground cisterns in the rural West. So next is recreation and parks. A good portion of this section of the supporting infrastructure chapter describes the Land Preservation, Parks and Recreation Plan, also known as the LPPRP. And this was just updated in 2022 and has the 5 aspirations that are listed here. So demands for new and improved parkland and recreational programming will increase with growth of the county's population. The 2022 LPPRP set an acquisition goal of 25 acres of parks and open space per 1,000 residents. The LPPRP also uses the Maryland Park Equity Tool to analyze residents' access to a facility, park, open space, or amenity. And what the analysis found is that there are more areas with low park access or low park equity in areas of the East. So policy statements and actions highlighted for recreation and parks include maintaining and expanding the county's offerings to keep pace with future growth, ensuring safe, convenient, and equitable access, establishing acquisition goals in the LPPRP, and prioritizing acquisition within communities with low park equity. Oh, and one more. And using flexible designs for parks and open space in more urban areas or, like the activity centers that we've spoken about in prior work sessions. So the next grouping of topics includes county facilities and allied agency facilities. In terms of county facilities, the county plans for renovation and maintenance of office space on an ongoing basis, but there is opportunity to evaluate the county's full portfolio of all leased and owned spaces over the long-term time frame of the plan, which is through 2040. And as far as policies and actions, highlights include continuing to invest in maintaining and enhancing county facilities, assessing agency space needs against the county's portfolio, determining whether the county should continue all or some leases, determining whether the county should continue to own or surplus various properties, and all while considering finite land supply and the future cost of acquisition. So now we'll turn to allied agency facilities. This includes the library system and the community college, which are governed by a board of trustees, but are subject to the county's approval when it comes to capital and operating budgets. And policies and actions highlighted for allied agencies include partnering with the library system to provide training and resources in the community, evaluating the need for additional library capacity, and for the community college, continuing to support the college's expanding abilities to provide higher education for county residents and workers. And now we'll turn to the last topic grouping for supporting infrastructure, which is drinking water, wastewater treatment, and solid waste management. So the county plans for public water and sewer services in its master plan for water and sewerage. This is a document that must be consistent with the general plan, and it identifies priority areas for service within the PSA. There's also a water and sewer capacity allocation program, and this involves assigning priorities for new connections through the development review process, and is done to ensure that demand does not exceed available system capacity. So about 85% of the county's population is connected to the public water supply system. There are legal agreements in place for water service from Baltimore City and WSSC. And water and sewer capacity was evaluated by the Department of Public Works based on projections associated with the future land use map. And what was found is that available water capacity is not expected to be a constraint to future growth. Then on the wastewater treatment side, 84% of the county's population is connected to the public sewer system. There are 2 service areas and 2 treatment plants, one being the Little Patuxent plant in Savage, and the other being the Patapsco treatment plant in Baltimore City. Like the water supply, treatment capacity was found to be adequate to meet future needs associated with the future land use map. And then outside of the PSA, the Rural West uses wells and septic systems. And there are different types of each of these. Individual, multi-use, and community pertain to both wells and septic systems. And then for septic, there are also shared septic systems. And in terms of capacity, there's generally an adequate supply of good quality groundwater in the Rural West, and soils can generally support septic system drain fields. And then as far as solid waste management, the county provides weekly curbside collection for most residents, and a key goal is to divert waste through reduction, reuse, and recycling. The chapter also notes how the county is encouraging new solid waste technologies, such as biodigesters. So to conclude, policies and actions highlighted for water, wastewater, and solid waste management include ensuring the safety and adequacy of the drinking water supply, promoting water conservation and reuse, ensuring the adequacy of the public wastewater treatment system, reducing nitrogen loads from septic systems, and diverting waste from landfills by promoting reduction, reuse, and recycling. And with that, we'll conclude the presentation on supporting infrastructure and turn it back to the chair.
Okay. All right, so we'll go to Dr. Jones.
Good morning again, everyone. Nor on chapter, it sounded like the presentation was for chapter 8, even though I know we're talking about 9 first, or 8, 9, and 10 together, but I don't have any questions on the presentation we just saw. Thank you.
So my question is really a little bit looks back and then looks forward again, because I recognize that this is really a forward-looking plan. But I guess I'm wondering sort of where our existing mix of units and their associated income and property tax revenues support our maintenance of the existing infrastructure. And so sort of what is our current capacity? I don't know if this is a Jeff Brownell. I see you pondering back there. But I guess I'm looking at sort of, if we look at what we have, does this cover our long-term maintenance needs, considering sort of the age of a lot of our communities? Columbia, the largest one, is hitting 55, and so a lot of the maintenance is really coming up. So I guess in where we are today, do we have the base to cover the maintenance for all of the water pipes in Columbia, all of the sewer pipes in Columbia? And then this plan as proposed, does it help? How does that impact the ability to support our infrastructure and maintenance needs? Oh, sorry. Yep.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Brownell.
So regarding the question about water and sewer, I think one distinction that needs to be made, that's an enterprise fund. So it's designed to support future and existing. So the rates, I think the budget office could probably speak more cogently about this, but the rates are designed, and the property tax is designed to kind of pay for that. regarding the general fund, we did a fiscal impact study, and the fiscal impact study was designed really to look at new growth. It didn't really look at existing. So we did show in the fiscal impact study that the new growth, based on the scenarios we analyzed, generate net positive revenues. So a lot of those net positive revenues can be used to then pay for some existing infrastructure needs. But analysis hasn't been conducted to determine what the extent of the unfunded infrastructure is in the county. That's probably something that should be looked at some point.
I think it's a
general
prior to October 2nd?
Well, I think it's a general, it's really not a general plan question, I would say. It's really something that impacts communities all across the country. Maintaining existing infrastructure is something that needs to be addressed in communities all over the country.
Right.
You know, generally, unlike the private sector, the public sector doesn't necessarily depreciate assets and plan for that. If you look at the history of the country, a lot of the existing infrastructure was subsidized by the federal and state governments, and that's kind of changed over time. And in counties like Howard County that are, now I guess so-called, middle-aged, so you have some infrastructure that's now, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. Now's the time to start looking at that. How do we maintain the existing infrastructure as we continue to grow?
I mean, then we're really, if we have the enterprise funds covering our water and sewer, I mean, the biggest deferred maintenance burden then we have is our school system. And so I think part of the question that we need to analyze and get to in this general plan process is how much are we increasing our assessable base by, and how much does that increase our bond capacity by, so we can address these deferred maintenance issues.
Right, yes. I mean, I think that question is good to look at. But again, I think it's important to discern between that being part of a general plan process and that being part of a general budgeting capital process of the county as a whole. I mean, they're sort of intermixed, clearly, because the county is continuing to grow. But the concept of how to maintain the existing infrastructure is, relative to the current tax base, is in a certain way a different question, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's one that I ask a lot, because we get into budget, and this is, I mean, we're just talking capital, but when you go to the operating side, if there's a year after year request of an additional $60 million, then we need to figure out, if we want to meet that need in the school system, then we need to figure out how to meet that need in our general fund. And that comes from property and income tax.
Right.
So that's why I'm looking at the number of units, the types of units, who's in the units, to get to that number. So that way we can fund some of our resources that we just heard our residents really appreciate.
Yeah, exactly. And we showed that future growth does generate net positive revenue. So in large part, based on the scenarios, we looked at all the different types of unit types moving forward in the 4 scenarios. And then we had the general plan scenario that I presented and we're going to have a future question and answer session, I believe, in 2 weeks about the fiscal impacts. We looked at those, and the model showed that new growth generates net positive revenues. So to the extent that new growth continues, to that degree, we'll have additional funds to help pay for some of the maintenance needs of the existing infrastructure.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Young?
Thank you. I'm on a completely different topic here, which I'm not even sure that you guys addressed in this slideshow. So I'm going to go back here to the Vulnerable Population Index that was discussed throughout this infrastructure chapter. And I first would like to know what specific document are you referring to when you're talking about the Vulnerable Population Index, and can you provide us with a copy of it?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So, and I might call on either Mr. Gartner from Office of Transportation or Mr. Cookson. But the Vulnerable Population Index, I believe, is a tool that they use as a part of the Complete Streets effort that came out of the Complete Streets policy analysis. So I don't know if Mr. Cookson or Mr. Gartner.
I did see that.
Okay.
So let me go off in a different direction. How were you planning to implement this index with these with capital planning projects that have been discussed in this infrastructure chapter?
Yeah, so I don't think we're suggesting we specifically will need to use that vulnerable population index. That's just an example of how we've incorporated equity into some of our existing policies and programs. So the way that the general plan suggests that we try to incorporate equity into capital planning, first we'll have to explore how to implement a process. So we'll have to determine what that process is as to how we engage some underserved communities, develop a process to identify those underserved communities. So that's all something that would take place once the general plan is adopted.
So there really isn't any further thought about how this would or could be planned to capital projects at this point beyond what the Complete Streets have already been doing?
Right, nothing beyond what we've identified as examples or suggestions to look at once the general plan gets adopted, but it is something that we're suggesting be evaluated as a part of future capital planning efforts.
Okay, so then you also talked about this outreach process as an example, a diverse and inclusive outreach process for capital planning. And other than budget hearings, which the county council has, I think we had 3, but it seemed like there were 7. But I may be wrong. And the county executive had 2, I think one for capital and one for operating. Other than these budget hearings, what are you considering for diverse outreach to vulnerable populations?
Yeah. So once we, so in the implementation chapter, we have a matrix where we identify various agencies that would work with us or would lead these particular efforts. So this is an effort where we identified the Office of Human Rights and Equity to be a part of developing that outreach process.
So right now, there's nothing on the books. This is just a statement in the plan.
Correct.
Okay. Because then there was also I think it was another comment about socially vulnerable populations. I'm looking for that right now, which I thought would probably have already been identified by our Department of Community Services. That I don't know, but it seems like they would know who that population is. Socially, work with partners to develop a methodology to identify socially vulnerable communities. So, and I was just curious if there isn't already a methodology that has been accepted academically. Don't we already know who those socially vulnerable communities are?
Yeah,
I have
thanks.
those questions.
Sure. Thanks for pointing out the Department of Community Resources, because they are also another implementing partner for this particular policy, along with the Office of Human Rights and Equity. So my understanding is that, I don't know if they necessarily have the methodology quite yet developed to specifically say on a map, this is where our socially vulnerable communities are. But that would be, again, all a part of a process and a methodology that would be developed in collaboration with those departments and offices.
So then my last question on this topic, and I do have more topics, but I'll finish with this topic, and that is there any thought that we would include this equity index or a focus on socially vulnerable communities in our comprehensive rezoning?
So is the question, how would we incorporate this?
Have you given that any thought to comprehensive rezoning?
I don't, you want to jump in?
For example,
So
as an example, not allowing exclusive communities to be built that have no apartments or townhomes, requiring everyone to do MIHU, and not allowing fee in lieu. I could go on, but those are just 2 examples.
Yeah, so I think the way I would answer this is essentially, the general plan provides the guidance. It says these are the goalposts, this is where we want to go, these are the important factors that we need to incorporate into all of our future planning processes and all of our efforts. And so when we get to the comp rezoning process, everything we do as part of that is going to consider those goals that were outlined in the general plan, including the focus on equity. So that's a question, essentially, by including in the general plan, you're having everything you do as moving forward for every plan and every action is, how does this affect equity? Who's being affected by this? Does this promote the goals that we're trying to achieve?
So equity will be considered during the course of comprehensive rezoning. The answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you for that question and the example. The example helped.
Okay.
And yes.
Thank you, Ms. Young. Mr. Youngman?
Sticking, I guess, on the same sort of topic, what is an equity-based approach, equity in capital planning mean? And I guess this is not as much on the development side, but on the capital planning side for, I guess, government infrastructure?
Yeah, so a lot of this comes from, so historically, throughout the country, there have been many communities that have been underserved, right? Underserved with infrastructure investments, and maybe there are just other communities that have been prioritized. We haven't specifically identified where those locations or if those locations necessarily exist in Howard County. And I don't know if Matt Noonkester's on the line, if he would want to speak a little bit more from a national perspective about how this works. But generally speaking, the idea is that it's a recognition that there are some underserved communities in our community, underserved communities in our county, and trying to determine, well, how have they received less infrastructure investments than other places, and then how do we help bring them up to basically the same playing field as all other communities?
Okay, that actually answers my question.
Okay, great.
So it's, if we identify, and we're not sure whether we have them or not, areas of the county that, and it's not it's not equal, right? Because like the West has different types of things than the Southeast has, but appropriate for their part of the county. If there's communities that, their sidewalks are falling apart or something like that, then this would be a way to prioritize dollars to those underserved communities to the extent that we identify them.
Correct, yes. It's a way to prioritize additional dollars to those places that need additional investment.
That's all I need.
Okay.
Ms. Walsh?
I have a follow-up on what Ms. Rigby said, and I completely disagree with the answer that you gave to her. We need context here. I think it's a complete fallacy to make the statement that new development pays for itself as though it's in isolation. I mean, these children aren't going to travel on other county roads on their school buses or go to other public services. I mean, this is the same fallacy that has led us to be in the hole we're in now, which is if we always say new development pays for itself, then why are we in these holes in school maintenance, in road maintenance? We hear about it every budget season. We just heard about it in the last budget season. Of course, we need context. If we're going to take on these new demands and the new public infrastructure that they require, then we need to understand that we can pay for their operating and maintenance costs going forward, and how we do that in addition to what already exists. I mean, again, how can you look at this so myopically that we're only considering these 5 so-called activity centers as though nothing else in the county exists and everything else is going fine? That's completely not the case. The second answer was, both of these answers to Mr. Youngman and Ms. Young, we'll think about that later. How do you not know right now where our underserved communities are? Like, what have you been doing? I know where my underserved communities are. Like, this is the plan for the next 10 years, and we're still thinking about it? I don't understand. These exercises, I think, is theater. I would like to know, my original question was going to be, where is the discussion of the detention center or the hospital or other public infrastructure needs that aren't even discussed in your slide or in this book? And maybe others. I can't think of others, but the detention center was a big one. Mental health facilities, if you want to separate that from the hospital. But there are other needs additional to what's just described in this book. Did you consider them? What's the answer to that?
So my initial answer to that is, so generally, A general plan focuses on infrastructure, right? Infrastructure needs associated with new growth and development. So typically, we don't necessarily take a look at what hospital demands are because the county doesn't own the hospital, right? We can occasionally support a hospital system, but it's fairly much a private entity. Yes, it is a need in our county, but a general plan doesn't look at how we support necessarily private entities.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a fair statement. That's come up in the past about the previous APFO task force rose the issue of hospitals, and there was quite a discussion. And there was a discussion that basically the hospital is a privately funded entity, and it's not a government hospital. So it's not looked at directly in the general plan.
Okay, what about a detention center? There's a whole section on police. There's a whole section on fire. The ambulance is driving them to a hospital, right? Or the police after they are judged guilty or driving them to a prison or before they're even judged guilty. How is that not part of our infrastructure need?
Well, there is a Howard County Detention Center, and I would say that's a good point.
Didn't know that.
We could certainly include the detention center in the general plan as a potential infrastructure. And again, I would say that the general plan is intended to be sort of a higher level document, right, with general policies, and so it's not really intended to discuss and come up with solutions for every piece of public infrastructure.
Sure, but this
General
is so
categories.
high level and so generally applicable that there is hardly any distinguishable thing about county other than the maps. I mean, you didn't know we had a Howard County Detention Center? You don't know where the underserved areas in our county are? Like, what about this has anything to do with our communities that we represent and their individuality? It is too vague. There is no context. I don't know when we're going to do all of these follow-on analyses in addition to a general plan and an Apfo commission and all that, but I don't think these answers are good enough and are sufficient to justify this document or these hearings or my presence at them. That's all I have.
All right. Well, everyone's attendance is certainly optional as long as we have 3, I think, Mr. Cook. I guess just a more general question, because this kind of goes to where we were talking about earlier. The way that I viewed this, and it would be helpful to get context if I'm approaching this correctly, but the policy actions and implementing pieces, this comes in and you say, we're going to use this policy statement. And then when we get to, the code requires that Apfo committee be stood up within 1 year of the passage of the general plan. It doesn't ask us to do Apfo before the general plan. It asks us to do it within 1 year following. So the policies, so when we're looking at, I guess this is the next chapter for managing growth, but all of those would sort of go before the Apfo committee because this is the beginning. This is what says we want us have to agree to this is what we want to do in the future. And then after we've agreed that this is what we want to do in the future, then we take that piece into the next step, such as the Apfo committee. Or when we go into comprehensive zoning or the code rewrite, we're filtering it. It's all going through this filter of the general plan. And if it, and the policies are sort of where it's directing us to go for the next steps, just in case all 5 of us die in some horrible accident and there's 5 new people who have to come on and plan for the county. Then there's this document for people who weren't in these seats to then take those steps to address this county document that the people in the county council seats and the people in the executive seats and the people in the planning seats work together with the community to create.
I'm gonna try to kind of approach your comment as well as some of the comments that Ms. Walsh made in my understanding of the general plan, which is that the general planning process is broadly applicable to a multitude of other functional plans, actions, codes, legislation, and decision-making that moves forward over the next 20 years. And so it essentially says, These are the broad issues that are affecting us right now. This is what we anticipate in the future that may be affecting us. These are the changes in technology. These are the changes in our demographics that might alter our needs and what we need to be able to pivot to in the future. And then as you take those functional plans for all of the public infrastructure and what the other entities sitting behind us sort of govern, they're supposed to infuse that through their planning and decision-making process as well. And I know that's a very vague general statement, but that is the purpose of the general plan, is to provide that overarching guidance as you then get into the specifics, so that when you're debating a particular piece of legislation or a particular zoning code rewrite or a functional plan decision of capital project planning, you can say, well, how does this align with the broad goals of the general plan, which identifies across the board many different topics, areas, goals. Does that help in providing the...
So as an example, I did see Mr. Moody back there. So for example, Recreation and Parks has the LPPRP, and then they would have the general plan, and those two would filter together for their strategic plan.
Yes, that is correct. The LPPRP does take guidance from the general plan.
And
the LPPRP
Land Preservation,
is...
Parks, and Recreation Plan.
Thank you.
I've got it now, but I knew there were parks. There's a lot of P's. Okay. And then also I would say that I think that that's a worthy, the detention center is a worthy amendment to seek, because we talked about it during the budget session. I mean, there's obviously a lot of criminal justice changes happening. The detention center, well, like everything in this county, everything in the world, what choices made, 40 years ago were made in that context, and now we have choices to make in 2023 in our current context. So I imagine that the detention center we built then is not the type of detention center that we would build today, because we have different goals. But I think that that would be a worthy amendment to this. Ms. Young? Oh, and I skipped Dr. Jones, I just realized.
No, that's fine.
Sorry.
Great points. And to these points, I think one of the things, and I don't want to discuss it now because I think we've got enough work sessions going forward that we can do this, but how do we amend this plan? What do we do? Do we literally cross out words and add our own words? Do we get rid of a chart? Do we say no to Gary's saying yes. Okay, that's all we need to do. All right.
Yeah.
Go through every word? Oh, that's going to be a lot. Okay. All right. And I think talking about, because this chapter, I think more so than others, brought up these issues, which is why Ms. Walsh is reacting, whoa, which I have to admit, when I was reading it, I had some of the same reactions. I'm like, whoa. First of all, police. Everything in here that was said about the police, they're already doing. I'm like, why do we have a chapter about police saying they should ride their bikes down greenways and they should, plan for new stations? And I'm like, this is like already what the police are doing. We just had them in budget before us. We know that they're doing that. So I was confused. The same with fire. They should be planning for new stations. They should be, of course the fire's already doing that. They know that they need to do that. They've got their strategic plan. So I too was confused as to why things that are already being done in the county are being repeated in the general plan. But I think this is a good conversation. I'm glad that we're having it, trying to understand how the general plan works with these other departments, why it would be here in the general plan, even though it is something that's already being done by the departments. But that does bring me back to some specific questions for police and fire. But I want to start with the general question first. So the total number of units that are suggested in the chapter Managing Growth are around 24,000. It says 19,000, but then we add 5,000 on that are green structures, yes, and another 2,500 that are affordable housing, whatever that means. So it's actually 24,000 units, and that does not include Gateway, correct? And what is the thought about Gateway? How many units are we considering right now for Gateway?
We're not considering that number at this time. That is something that will come out of the master plan process when we look more deeply at all of the infrastructure demands that would be associated with the desired development.
Okay, I'm
We've seen a chart that showed 7,000,
7,000.
and I don't know where that chart was. I don't
I'm
know if it
thinking
was
at least
yours.
10 by the time it's
But
said
I
and done,
mean,
but, okay.
Somebody's considered something because we saw a slide on it.
I thought we did too, yeah. But, okay, I'll put 7 on this. So that's a total of 31,000 units. So has anybody at DPZ considered how many people will be living in Howard County if we were to actually build 31,000 units? And the reason I'm asking that is, have fire and police given thought to, if we have 31,000 units, let's say that's another 90,000 people. I don't know. You guys, I assume, know these numbers better than me. Is that an average of 3 people per unit? I have no idea. Is it an average of 2 people per unit? And assuming whatever the
we can't
number
throw those
is,
numbers out there like that.
assuming whatever the number is, where have police and fire identified how many stations, well, particularly fire, how many new stations would we need? And police, how many more officers would we need? And then back to fire, how many more fire and rescue personnel would we need? Because to me, that seems like, of all the things, since everything else I think fire and police are already thinking about in the general plan, those seem like the most important questions going into the future. You look like you might know the answer to the question, Mr. Brown.
Well, I don't know the answer to that specifically. I mean, I think the police can address that. But this gets back to the point that Ms. Rigby said, and also you said earlier. The general plan is a land use plan. So one of the values of the land use plan is a 20-year plan. We have the population projections. We have calculated that. We have the housing unit projections. We have the employment projections in the general plan. And those functional plans that's referred to and the items discussed in the supporting infrastructure about police and fire, that's really just to point out that these agencies will be based on the general plan, which has the projected units. And so all of the different agencies are provided projections from DPZ whenever they do their functional plans. So the police, they have done a plan where I've given them projections. And I don't know.
Population projections.
Population projections.
So what are the
housing units.
population projections? Do we have those?
We do, and that's in the fiscal analysis presentation that I gave last time, I believe.
Okay, can you
so-
remind me what they are then? I didn't
So
go
I
back and look at that.
I don't have that in front of me because I wasn't prepared to talk about that, but they're based on the 25,000 units projected forward. There's an average of about 2.7 people per household. Now, it will vary because the projections in the general plan and also the fiscal impact analysis, there's going to be more apartment units and condos moving forward because of the activity center concept and the land use that's left in the county. So the persons per household in apartments and condos is less than, single family houses and townhomes. So I can certainly give you the population. I just don't have that in front of me now.
Okay, well,
It's probably less than it's probably like 2.2, something like that, because of the mix of units. But we do have that number, and we do provide that number to the agencies when they update their functional plans every 4 years or whatever it is.
And just a note, we're doing the fiscal analysis Q&A
Right.
next
yeah.
session as well. So we'll have another opportunity to review and discuss that because it's pretty
right.
critical.
Okay, yeah,
We
I
didn't
mean,
get a
just
chance last
quick,
time.
67,500. That's, 2.7 times 25,000. So,
Well, you just said it was more like 2.2.
depending on the mix, but overall, the 2.7.
Depending on the mix. Christ.
Yeah.
Let's just stick to the numbers.
All right, let's proceed with Ms. Young's questioning.
Okay, thank you. So, yes. Doesn't matter. Hello, hello. Hello. Okay, so, Chief, you've heard the whole conversation because I saw you back there.
Yes.
Yes. So, how do you respond? How are you, how many have you thought about this? Have you thought about how many new fire stations we would need? And equally important, have you considered where we would locate those fire stations? Because I think about the fact that it's taken us 4 years to locate one fire station, and what are we going to do in the future about that?
Yes. We have taken those things into consideration. We have a really robust data analysis team that looks at, one of the things we looked at was the 2030 plan, to look at the different growth areas, look at call volume. We shared some heat maps with you all, and we look at all of that data to try to anticipate where we would need stations. We are certainly glad to be a part of these conversations. We had a good meeting with DPZ to share some of what we think our needs are moving forward. So we're welcome these opportunities to sit and have these conversations so that they can see where some of our needs are. I think Councilwoman Walsh was bringing up the situation as far as the hospitals, but it is a private entity that is kind of out of our control. But I think it's important that DPZ understands what some of our concerns and needs are as it relates to fire and rescue, as it relates to the growth in the county and things like that. So we have a really strong data analysis team that we want to make sure that we share.
The potential of 67,000 more people, how many more personnel do you think you would need?
So obviously the call volume would increase, which station-wise, depending where the growth is, we may have good response time coverage. It may mean more resources, such as an additional ambulance or something like that. And with that comes additional personnel. So based upon the number, it's hard to predict what the actual call volume would be. Our data analysis team does give us some information there, so it would probably require additional personnel.
Do you have room at your stations now to expand them if you needed to actually expand them, as opposed to finding land to build a new station?
In some of the stations, like the new Waterloo station, we could add an additional ambo there, which would be helpful in different areas. But ideally, depending on what the growth is, it may require an additional station.
So does DPZ put in its plan, this is where a fire station could be located if we put another 10,000 people along the Route 40 corridor?
So I do want to point out that this general plan, it is a long-range plan. So this is looking at a minimum of 20 years in the future. And then with Gateway, we don't anticipate that coming online for at least another 20 years and beyond. So with regards to what the general plan suggests, no, it doesn't get into the specifics of where specifically might be an ideal location for a fire station. When we get into, say, a master plan or one of the more functional plans, that's where there could be opportunities to start to locate potential areas. But at this level, no, we don't specifically say this is where we know we're going to need a fire station, because we only generally know what our land use plan is moving forward in the future.
Okay, fair enough. But it scares me, given our history, just in the last 4 years, that it's taken 4 years to find a spot to put a new fire station, and it's been more than 4 years, actually, because it's moved 3 times now. And now it's taken 2 years, 3 years maybe, to get through the red tape to get that fire station built. And these are real concerns. These are real, actual concerns when we say we're going to add 67,000 people, that we can't even get a new fire station built within 6 years. So that's my thought process. When I'm looking at this plan, I want the chief to be able to serve the people of Howard County in the best way possible. So, and as long as you did bring up the hospital, and so I will also say that is a huge concern. We don't even have capacity at that hospital right now, and Chief Winston knows this. They get in the AMBO. They try and take them to Howard County General. They can't. They get turned away because there's no room for them there. And while we can say it's not really a private, I guess it is a privately owned entity because it's owned by a nonprofit corporation, but it is still the only ambulance that serves Howard County residents, and there's probably nothing that is more of a bigger concern to more of our residents than the fact that there is not enough space in that emergency room and that people have to wait 6 and 7 hours now. So I don't know how we can just ignore, oh, we're going to add 67,000 people. And does that 67,000 people, do the 24,000 units include the 1,200 units or 1,400 units at Erickson? Do you know if it includes that?
I believe that those have already been included in previous Apfo calculations. Jeff, do you know in what year? I don't know in what year Erickson pulled from in terms of Apfo housing allocation.
It was approved more than a year ago, I think. Yeah.
It does include the Erickson units.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's mostly people over the age of 70, which will have a huge hospital end-of-life need. I recognize that they have people on campus take care of their everyday health needs, but people still need hospitals. So that is a concern. But I'm going to move over here to police, and I'll stop, I promise. Okay.
Can we go to Mr. Youngman?
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Youngman?
I mean, I have a lot of questions like this too, but I mean, all this is in the financial modeling, and we're having a separate work session on that. Okay, just want to make sure. What does small-scale development mean? You referred to small-scale development with respect to septic infrastructure.
Yeah, so that I believe has to do with creating so small-scale development might be duplexes or some of these more diverse housing types that we're contemplating. So those diverse housing types, if there's 2 or more units on one lot, that would need a shared septic system, or if it's more than that, it could require a multi-use septic system. So I believe that's what the small-scale development is referring to. Also could be referring to what we're looking at for the rural crossroads, which are small-scale opportunities for infill development and smaller mixed-use buildings with ground floor retail and upper-story residential.
Well, isn't this an issue now that the health department's not here, but for the Lyos property where they're doing the duplexes, unfortunately, the way MDE defines it is that then became a multi-use. Even if I put a private system on my lot and I split my house in 2, now it's 2 units, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the technology's there. It's just more how MDE defines it and how our health department interprets it. So how do you get through those things? Those are state agencies.
Yeah. When we get to the Dynamic Neighborhoods chapter, we have invited the Department of Health there, and we have some of those policies noted in there, but it does recognize that we do need to work with our state agencies to determine how we need to evaluate all of our codes and what code changes would need to be made to facilitate the use of those shared and multi-use septic systems.
And then you mentioned, and it relates to the rural crossroads as well. And this particular, the multi-use septic headwind is on the residential. But when you look at the rural crossroads opportunities, are those all residential opportunities, or are those residential and commercial opportunities, mixed-use opportunities?
We're looking at them as mixed-use opportunity areas.
Okay. So, thanks.
Ms. Walsh?
I'll stick on this notion of septic versus sewer delivery. I found two what I thought to be conflicting statements just in this chapter. One talks about, I don't know, the ecological disruptiveness of sewer lines on page 6 versus on page 54, we say that individual septic systems can be a water quality concern because of the amount of nitrogen discharged to the groundwater. It isn't making the policy decision about whether we want to encourage connection to existing or extended sewer system or relying on septic. I mean, is that not a policy goal, or which, like, how do I reconcile even those two statements in this same chapter? And then is there a determination in this plan, or when will it be made, as to which we would prioritize? Because this seems to leave it open to either one. We could connect to a septic, or we could connect to a sewer line.
So I think that the statements do work together, but they work for different site-specific criteria and requirements. So essentially, think of it this way, is that where it makes sense to connect to sewer because we have a certain density of development where you cannot accommodate a septic sewer without impacting the environmental concerns, then you need to connect to sewer. But otherwise, we need to have our code and regulations ensure that the density and the intensity of development can exist on septic without creating that concerning nitrogen load. Does that, if that makes sense? So essentially, it's those two policies inform our land use and regulation decisions as they apply when we get to the parcel level, when we do the comp rezoning, and saying, you know, this is the kind of density that can be on septic, and this is the kind of density that has to be on public water and sewer, if that makes sense.
I mean, it does make sense. That's what we're doing now, right?
Yeah.
But the overall concept, if we're really pretending like this is a general plan that's guiding what we do for the next 20 years, isn't it going to say we aren't going to extend the PSA, or we are going to allow developments comparable to Lighthouse or something smaller or bigger, reliant on shared or individual septic systems? Like, what right now, if this is enacted, there's no, you can do whatever you want. If it's intense, then, and it's close to septic, or I mean, it's close to sewer, then you connect to sewer. If it's intense and you can do a multi-shared system, then you can do a multi-shared system. Like, how, just on that particular example, how does this provide any definition in terms of what we're going to do if we're going to go to now we're talking about specifics. Now it's parcel by parcel.
So the plan specifically in Infrastructure Policy 10 is talking about encouraging large development sites added to the current PSA and large redevelopments within the PSA to minimize increased flow and minimize nutrient concentration. So I think this is specifically talking about the fact that we still have properties within the PSA that aren't yet connected to water and sewer. And I do have Art Shapiro here, if I don't know if there's anything else where you would want him to explain the fact that we have some sites that are within our PSA but not yet in the either metropolitan district or connected to water and sewer.
All right, correct me if I'm wrong. In one of the prior work sessions, and there have only been 2, right?
This is the third.
Yep, it's the third.
You identified the actual sites. One only needed water or something, and 2 others we were expecting to extend both public water and public sewer.
That was to bring into the planned service area.
Okay, so in that case, you were explicit. These are the 3 sites. This wasn't a general plan. We're thinking generally in 20 years, what could happen? Don't know. Don't have a plan. You had 3 sites that you identified for, I think, the next 20 years, right? So why are we even, why don't we say then that anything on the other side can be no bigger than, or can only have this many connected to, or something? Isn't that supposed to be then definitive?
So the general plan specifically identifies where the planned service area boundary is, and then we have a water, sewer, and master plan that looks at how we would then connect those properties to our public water and sewer treatment systems. So I don't know if I'm fully understanding your question is what else are you thinking the general plan should be looking at? So there's a specific role for the water, sewer, and master plan to ensure that we provide services to sites within the PSA, and then the general plan determines where the planned service area boundary line is.
Okay. I mean, I'm coming from the perspective of sprawl, bad, intense concentration, particularly around public transport or public amenity, good. So
Okay.
if that's the case, then the PSA is supposed to be fixed, but even the 5 of us have consented to extend it for a significant development. Why wouldn't we say, or do we even say that, sprawl bad? This to me reads, if you want to build outside of the public sewer line, then you got to build the septic, whatever MDE and other requirements say. I just don't understand how that's defining. Like, why would we leave it? It's entirely open as I read it now.
No. There's a lot of discussion about the importance of preserving the planned service area boundary line, and there are only 2 small sites that are identified in the general plan to be included within the PSA. It's specifically for public schools have requested that 1 small site be included, and then there's 1 small site that is requesting water service only. It is 1 single property. So generally speaking, we think that we should be preserving and protecting the PSA. However, because we're looking at ways to create more opportunities for diverse housing, should there be opportunities outside of the PSA, they would have to pursue multi-use septic systems. Now, of course, there's also a recognition that we're trying to preserve and protect the character of the rural West, so these would not be large redevelopment sites that would be occurring outside of the PSA. It would just to create limited, very small-scale opportunities to, again, expand diverse housing types outside of the PSA.
Okay, where in this does it say that?
That's in the Dynamic Neighborhoods chapter.
Okay.
All right, Dr. Jones?
Thank you. No, I don't have any questions at the time.
I'm actually going to ask Mr. Shapiro to come up because thank you, Chief Winston. You were very gracious and really helped me understand septic better. Because when I was looking at our wastewater treatment plan, I was looking at the total flow. But one thing that you help me understand is that when septic is deposited at our wastewater treatment plant, it is a more concentrated load that is being delivered to the wastewater treatment plant.
There we go. Okay. I'm sorry. When a septic hauler goes to clear a septic system, they'll pump out the holding tank. The holding tank holds solids and undigested material. The water passes through the holding tank and it's decanted off the top, and it goes into the drainage field, and it's absorbed and goes back into the environment. The solids and the undigested material goes back to the treatment plant, and it's blended into the normal treatment process. And that is concentrated by the fact that it has more solids and less liquid.
And because when we're looking at our wastewater treatment plant capacities, we're looking at those gallon flows, which is inclusive of the water that we have to treat.
Right.
Whereas with septic, there's less water.
Less water.
And we're more focused on just the nutrient loads.
Right. It's getting the solids out of the water that's remaining and treating the water and making sure that it goes through the biological process so that we reduce the nutrients and the effluent from the plant meets the discharge permit.
So when we're calculating sort of what our capacities are, when we're looking at what's going through our sewer pipes, pumping stations, what how do you approach those calculations to ensure we have capacity there? And then how do you look at it at the same side, on the other side of it, on the septic side, to ensure we have capacity to receive the septic?
But the material that is brought in, it's always assumed that we look at it in a conservative way. So we assume that the liquid volume, and based on the consumption, based on the occupancy, I mean, that's the theoretical approach. We know in the case of Lyhus, for example, I think it was 12,000 and change gallons per day, and based on full occupancy. So we use that number to go into the calculations for loading, the projected loading into the treatment plant process.
And then you're using the same population calculations that Mr. Bronow was talking about earlier.
Yeah, so they're standardized. We know for every occupant or the residence is designed for so many occupants. Everyone is allocated a certain number of gallons per day.
And so when we're looking at who's coming on, we might say, okay, over the next 20 years, we're going to grow by this amount, but that's really each 20 year, we're adding a little bit more, not 60,000 people in 1 year.
That's right. You have to, I mean, you have to be realistic about the actual growth patterns. There are other things that are ancillary to the process. Technology changes.
Right.
The efficiency of treatment processes are changing. The regulatory environment we're in is changing. PFAS and all the other things that are coming to fore. All of those are being blended into the overall consideration when we look at the master plan, especially when you go out 10 years, 20 years.
Right. Thank you very much. I appreciate you helping me understand and then also reiterating this conversation for the public today.
No problem.
Thank you very much. Ms. Young?
Back to you. I have the same questions for you that I do for Chief Winston. What do you project are the needs by the police department for the potential growth of 67,500 people?
Well, we've been looking, obviously, at the Central District. We've been talking about it since 2017 and looking forward from there. If we were to stick with our current model of one officer for every 680, I guess, residents, we would be probably looking at anywhere between 90 and 100 officers over the course of 20 years. So that would be our projection to keep our numbers where they are. And with the higher population would come more business, I would assume, which would be higher calls for service, as Chief Winston said, and that would require more personnel.
You are, though, right now having difficulty recruiting police officers, correct?
Correct. I think we are much like every other agency, although we do have 30-plus officers starting on the 20th of this month. And we are currently at 483 of the 509 that we are authorized for, so that 30 will get us closer to that goal. So yeah, we are having difficulty recruiting. We're have a very robust recruiting strategy like everybody else in the region, so we're fighting for the same candidates.
Right. So do you see a need for, if we were to get the central station located centrally somewhere, do you see a need for another police station with this amount of growth? Or would the 3 major stations be adequate?
No, I believe the 3 major stations would be adequate, but having that centrally located station in downtown Columbia, where a third of the population of the county or more resides or works, would be beneficial to us, so that we don't have officers that work there but have to travel to either Ellicott City or Laurel to get to a police station for evidence collection, body-worn camera docking, those kind of things.
Right. Thank you. That's all the questions I have for you. But I did have some more questions for Mr. Shapiro. Where did he go? You thought you were done. You are water and sewer here, so and this is infrastructure. So I did have a couple of more questions. There was a comment in the general plan document that said that we should modify codes and regulations to remove impediments for existing development, new development, and redevelopment to implement water conservation and reuse practices and technology. But in the same document, it states that these practices have been discouraged or prohibited because of human health concerns. So I'm trying to understand, why would we remove these impediments if there are human health concerns, and what are those human health concerns? Because I presume that we would have to do that by legislation in order to encourage this. And then my second question was, there was a 29.9 million gallon daily flow predicted in 2040, and I was wondering what was the population that you based that number on. So those are my two questions.
Okay. On the first question, that's a broad question in terms of the regulation and the potential impacts of a septic system approach on the environment and on health. And I'm going to answer based on the assumption of LIHUS as an example. This is the multifamily units where the health department and the MDE regulations require separate systems for individual residences. And the LIHUS project was able to obtain some leeway from the regulators to allow for a shared septic system. That's as simple as I can put it. The concern about health, again, I don't want to speak specifically, but the fact of the matter is individual septic systems, one resident, one septic system, another resident, its own system. When you join them together as in terms of shared septic in one structure, the potential exists for the cross flow, and I'm not saying that any of these buildings that are being considered now are going to be twinned, meaning two homes going into one pipe and then that one pipe going to the septic system. In Baltimore City, there are still properties that have twin connections. The problem with those types of connections historically has been if something blocks the line and backs up the sewage, the resident that is creating the flow may not suffer, but the person who's joined may actually get the backup. So that's part of the concern about the terminology, shared septic. It gives people the impression that we're joining things together, and the regulation, the way it's written, prohibits that. And best practice prohibits it. We don't, in Howard County, that's not a practice. We don't twin sewer connections. That's that answer. The other, as far as the capacity of the wastewater plant and forecasting.
29.9 million gallons daily by 2040.
Right, and that's the regulators look at the design of the plant. Little Patuxent is considered best available technology. Right now, it's an ENR, an Enhanced Nutrient Removal Process. It's been modified 8 times over its history since the 70s, and it's improved. When process technologies were obtainable, we were able to install them and get more out of the plant. And the original plant, if you look at a photograph, was nothing more than a couple clarifiers, holding tanks. And now it's 12 acres of high technology and biosolids generation, things like that. The hydraulic capacity of the plant is based on the ability to carry the flow and achieve the discharge permit requirements that the regulators set reliably. That means, for us, we normally operate in the 20 MGD range. That's where we are right now. And hydraulically, that plant has carried 50 million gallons a day. But at 50 million gallons a day, when we had the floods and the heavy rains and the river adjacent to the plant was flooding, the plant was able to still process flow, but it's like anything else. The increased flow rate puts you closer to the point where the processes no longer have enough contact time to operate efficiently. So that's the reason the regulators require us to look at the design of our plant and our operations every year. And when we broach 80% of that maximum 29 MGD, the permitted limit, we're obligated then by the regulators to begin considering a new plant, another plant. And that building a new plant is a tremendous cost. I mean, it's that's not something done lightly. It's not, and it could take 10 or 12 years to get to from a point of design consideration to actually construction. So that's a bright line for any utility, not just Howard County.
Well, my question is, the projection was that in 2040, we would have that need of 29.9 million gallons a day. So I assume that you were basing that on an increase in population, because now it's much lower.
Yes, the increase in population and the density of development.
Okay.
Building up instead of this. It's taller buildings,
right.
more residents in smaller areas. Yeah.
So what do you recall what the number was that you used?
I don't.
You don't recall?
Yeah, I have our planning division would know that.
Okay, that would be
forecast.
useful for me to know. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Shapiro. All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Youngman, and then we'll go to managing growth and public school facilities presentation. And after a 5-minute break. Okay, well then we'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:01 to begin with managing growth and public school facilities. Thank you.